Good afternoon. Hope you all had a nice Thanksgiving weekend, a nice long weekend. I certainly did. I wanted to give a short lecture today on modernism, and I can't seem to get this screen sharing working, and I think I figured out why. There's nobody else here except me. So I'm having to imagine the audience, which reminds me of something Walter Ong once said, that the audience is always a fiction, which is fascinating to contemplate. I think the idea being that we never really know who's in the audience, and even if we do know the person, we don't know all about that person. So we have to kind of make that up as we go. And this is certainly the case with these video recordings. But I digress. And today we're looking at modernism, and I'm going to go to the week and review that. What I recommend that you do is download have your week open for this lecture, week 6, and also have those handouts open and available to you, because I'm going to run over those quickly. At any rate, modernism is really the description of the world since the Enlightenment, from the 18th century on, or since realism and the one-point perspective entered into art. Uh, it is the age of science, which of course is initiated much earlier by Galileo, Copernicus, and so on and so forth. But this idea of reason, certainly the Enlightenment was an age of reason, but modernism continued this idea that reason uh, could get us where we needed to go, that science and technology and rationality would be able to create a world um, free of hunger, poverty, war, plague, famine, pestilence, and so on and so forth, that basically we humans were the measure of all things, and we could accomplish whatever it was we set our minds to do. And of course, during this period, we have the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which starts in England in the 1820s and 1830s. And I have a handout on that for you. The characteristics of modernism, again, moving down the introduction to week 6, there is this sustained trust in reason. There is a belief, apart from any and all religious considerations, that truth is attainable. That is, that we can comprehend the truth about situations and we can act on that truth. There is this kind of optimism, a belief in the perfectibility of humans and society, in spite of a number of wars during this period. But then there are always wars and rumors of wars, are there not? Um, so a belief in progress, a belief that we can get better every day in every way. Well, if not every day, but every month, every year, year by year, decade by decade, we humans are progressing towards what? It's not always clear. When religion gets called into question, as it certainly was in the 18th and 19th centuries here in the United States and throughout the world, there's the problem of telos, which means purpose or end. What is the telos, the purpose or the end of life? What is this whole thing that we're a part of moving toward? And when science and technology take over, there's a problem. Um, what what kind of utopia are we moving towards? What kind of vision of the future does science give us? There is a belief in absolutes, but not the absolutes of religion, but that science and technology can get us where we want to go. There is, of course, this continued ethnocentrism. There's a belief in the supremacy of Western beliefs and institutions. And our discovery of the New Worlds 3 centuries previously, and our colonization of those worlds with our own values and norms continues to hold forth. And there is also in the West, and especially in the US and Europe, a belief in freedom and democracy. That is that the best approach, although we're going to see some challenges to this, especially with Hegel, is to have a free people, a representative government, and a balance of powers within the government. So this week I'm having you read chapter 11, a short piece by John Stuart Mill, chapter 20, short piece by David Hume, chapter 22, a piece by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, chapter 25, a piece by the romantic writer, American romantic writer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and chapter 30, a piece by his understudy, his disciple, Henry David Thoreau. And then there are actually three handouts. There's a handout on the Industrial Revolution, a handout on Hegel and Marx, and an updated table of thinkers where I added sections on Mill, Hume, and Hegel. Somehow they were left out. So for the quick reference guide, you've got that updated table of thinkers, and you can go over uh, those categories for the readings this week. And it at least gives you, in a nutshell, what it seems to me, at least, these people are talking about when they're talking about leadership, followership, and the dynamic involved in that relationship. So what I'd like to do is move on to the um, handout on the Industrial Revolution, and you might want to get that in front of you because to understand the readings for the early modern period, even though some of the writers we're looking at precede the Industrial Revolution, nevertheless, a lot of historical and economic change and social change has come about. If you think about 1780 versus 1880, it's a huge difference in 100 years. And there's less difference between 1380 and 1780. I'm talking primarily about Britain because the Industrial Revolution takes place in Britain. The birth of the modern world is coincident with the rise of industrialism, which also gives rise to capitalism and consumerism. The circadian rhythm and cycles of nature are broken. The world is driven now by those of the boom and bust cycles of production and consumption. We have steam-powered engines in the 1820s and 1830s. Textiles were the first to be mass produced. Cheap clothing becomes available. This happens very quickly in England and more slowly in the rest of Europe and the US. England now is the world power after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815 at Waterloo. There was peace and prosperity for most. And so the Industrial Revolution begins in England. London is the biggest, richest, and most influential city in the world, the first modern city. You have lights, theaters, and restaurants by 1890. You've got taxis and trains. But you have 50 to 60-hour work weeks, which is actually shorter than previously in the factories. All sorts of laws were introduced in the 1830s and 1840s in England and later here in the United States, requiring that children be of a certain age to work and limiting the number of hours that could be worked. There's leisure for the wealthy, at least, sports, music halls, bars, and so on and so forth. If you look at this chart about the population of London, in 1800 there was 1 million people, and in England 8 million. By 1840, London has doubled in size and population to 2 million, and there are 17 million in England. And by 1901, London, the largest city in the world, has 3 million people, and England itself has 32 million people. And for the rest of this handout, I kind of go through a number of interesting um, facts about the 19th century, about the death rate, um, about a break with the Middle Ages, the scientific and technological advances as we move from Romanticism into the Victorian age, the how much people were making at the time, and the beginning of a serious middle class of doctors, lawyers, and clergy, and how people are moving above the poverty line, but still, with 30 million people in England in 1830, 13 million people are still below the poverty line. And these are the kinds of things that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are going to scream about. The condition of the working class in England is the title of a book written by Friedrich Engels, and though there are some factual problems with it, it does capture a picture of the poverty in London and the other big cities in England. Karl Marx read this and was deeply upset by it, and deeply upset by it his whole life. And we'll get to Marx next week. That's really all I want to say about this handout. And what I'd like to do is move on to the Hegel and Marx handout, because Hegel is far more important than our textbook suggests. Uh, Hegel had this idea of idealism or ideaism in history, and how somehow the rational became the real. And you can see there in my handout under 1B the seven basic ideas of his absolute idealism. And he had a dialectic in place, which he actually got from one of the ancient Greek thinkers. Can't think of him now, but it was thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And throughout history, he says you'll see one movement set itself up, and then another movement set itself against that movement, and then eventually there will be a synthesis. So the synthesis cancels the conflict, the historical conflict between this group and that group and their points of view. It preserves and retains element of truth in both thesis and antithesis, transcends the opposition, and raises the conflict into a higher truth. Under D, what I think is really interesting is his history of the development of so-called self-consciousness. And how it moves from humans mastering physical and living objects, right? Picture the cave person, and the final stage of history, which is reason or rationality. And in this piece today, we look at the so-called master-slave relation. So I'd kind of like to start there today with the piece by Hegel, and that's in chapter 22, and particularly the issue of the so-called master-slave relation, or what he calls the master bondsman relation. And what's really interesting, to me at least, is he notes something. We always think that the manager or the supervisor, the boss, whoever it may be, is in charge. But Hegel points out that this actually is not the case. The problem is, on page 227, there's a reversal and a paradox. It turns out that the so-called master is actually dependent upon the slave and the work of the slave, and probably couldn't do the work him or herself. And this is often true, I think, in your workplaces, where the sometimes the managers and the supervisors couldn't do the day-to-day work of the line staff workers. And that's the main point that I want to pull out of this reading by Hegel. If you move to Hume, and that's chapter 20, think this is written in 1748, so it's still part of the Enlightenment. I probably should move this chapter to the Enlightenment, but here the point is Hume is this Scottish thinker who is an absolute skeptic and cynic. And his basic claim on page 214 is that no sovereign ever has any right to take anything from me. And this idea of some sort of social contract that is either implicitly or explicitly agreed to, Hume says, is a bunch of bunk. What we need is a government that is representative of the people. Read here some sort of democracy, but he doesn't spell out clearly what that is. If we move on to chapter 11, going backwards, John Stuart Mill. We have his selection on the considerations on representative government. This is written in 1861, and it's written against the so-called good despot claims that there can be a good tyrant. And what he argues is that, again, we have this movement away from focusing on leaders and focusing on followers. And in considerations on representative government, Mill is arguing on page 107, for example, that the aggregate of people are better than the sovereign, that the masses of people actually know better. And he was involved in the abolition of slavery in England. Earlier, his father was, and childhood genius, was reading Greek and Latin by the time he was 3 years old. I mean, a prodigious scholar who had a kind of mental breakdown at some point and said that he was actually saved by William Wordsworth, the Romantic poet. He began to read poetry and found that that provided a salve for his troubled soul. And we don't have anything from the Romantic poets, Byron, Shelley, or Keats, or Wordsworth in our readings for this course, but that's really what saved John Stuart Mill. After them, we move on to Emerson and Thoreau, who are representatives of the Romantic movement here in the United States. And we've got Emerson in chapter 25, a famous short essay called Man the Reformer. And basically, he's arguing that societies are corrupt. Political systems are corrupt. And humans must step in and reform the system. And we get the model for this kind of reformation of corrupt political and economic systems from nature itself. And the problem he gets into is how nature is the model. Page 260. We are to revise the whole of our social structure, the state, the school, religion, marriage, trade, science, and explore their foundations in our own nature. We are to see that the world not only fitted the former men, humans, but fits us, and clear ourselves of every usage which has not its roots in our own mind. What is a man born but to be a reformer, a remaker of what man has made, a renouncer of lies, a restorer of truth and good, imitating that great nature, capital N, which embosoms us all. So nature here becomes the model for the Romantic poets and the Romantic writers, both in Britain and in Germany, and here in the United States. And Emerson and Thoreau are the best representatives of that whole movement. Emerson's writing in 1841. Thoreau is writing in 1848. And this essay, Civil Disobedience, which is very famous, and I'm sure most of you have read a number of times, opens with "that government is best which governs least." And he's calling for humans to get back in touch with nature, to be connected to nature, and to learn from nature that which we have lost by way of so-called civilization, what one critic dubs civilization, the undoing of that which is natural, which sounds a lot like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And I know Emerson and Thoreau both read Rousseau. They also read the British Romantic poets, and certainly Schiller, the German Romantic writer. And so these are the 5 selections for this week. I again encourage you to go to the handy dandy table of thinkers and look up these writers before you read and after you read, and see if you agree that I have captured, just in essence, in a nutshell, what it is that they are all about. And additional note, there are 2 papers for this course. One is due at the end of this week. I sent an email about it. It's the Exploring Leadership paper, where you're looking at your own experience of leadership and followership, your own personal experience in a variety of different spheres. And then the final paper is due week 8. I think it's going to be on Saturday, the December, whatever that is. I don't have it in front of me. But that's the paper about the leader that you're actually studying. And I've set forth parameters in the assignment to help you to frame the paper that way. Hope this was useful. Got to run to another meeting. Take care, and we'll talk soon.